welcome to another expert Q&A here on Up and to the Right at Gradient Works. Today we've got Azim Nagri here with us. He's the EVP of Operations at Scorpion. So Azim, will you introduce yourself real quick? Give us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, no, great to be here, Hayes. Really excited to have an opportunity to chat with you more about one of my favorite topics on the planet. A little bit of background. So I've spent my entire career sort of doing strategy and operations. And for the last 10 or 15 years, I've been really focusing those efforts in the customer success arena. And so I've worked with, small companies and large startups as well, and really helping them sort of build, grow, and then optimize their customer success teams. So that's a little bit about my background.
Got it. Well, why don't we start real quick on a terminology thing, which
Sure.
I think is interesting. So when we talked about this discussion beforehand, I said, let's talk about expansion, retention, that kind of thing. You talk about customer success. I often see in companies this sort of split between the idea of account managers and customer success managers, and seeing customer success as more of the friendly part of helping the customer be successful, and the account managers as more of the, hey, let's pay up, right? So what do you let's just kind of level up on that terminology. Do you see customer success as the umbrella term for all of those activities, or is it kind of a subset of what you do with a customer?
Yeah, great question. And it seems like for every company that I work with, they've got a different set of terminology. So you've got the customer experience advocates, you've got the client success teams, customer success teams. So yes, there's a lot of looseness around the terminology. I think the way I sort of see things as a shorthand way of referring to this function overall of working with your customer, working with your existing customer base, is that customer success moniker. Within that, I think you can have other terms or other teams. So it could be your customer advocate, it could be your account management. You could even potentially wrap up into that customer support. The way I sort of see it is terms of almost the disciplines and the functions. So I see there being a role or a discipline where that person is responsible for managing the commercial relationship with the customer.
Right. Okay.
So that's making sure the contracts are in place and the renewals in place and the payments are being made. So it's really around understanding the commercial aspects of the relationship. There is a second role where it is really focused on making sure that your customer is getting value out of the product that you're trying to sell them. And so that could be, monitoring usage to make sure that they are actually using the platform, or providing them training if they need training, or it's about helping them understand the different use cases that the product can provide. Those are the sort of two functions. I think what you see is as companies grow and evolve, they start off with one person doing both. And then as the company grows and evolves, you might see a sort of a delineation between those two, recognizing that those are sort of two different skill sets.
Right. Does that, it seems that the more complex the product experience and the more difficult it is to, implement and ultimately kind of get to that level of getting value from it. It seems like that would lean more towards having a core CSM function that might be separate from the commercial relationship. So are there product elements that lend, you to making a decision to how you want to break up the commercial versus the success functions?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that sort of goes into that decision about whether you have separate account management teams and customer success teams, or whether you have the ability to combine them. So a couple of those variables include, to your point, the complexity of the product. Is this the type of product which actually does require a lot of hand-holding, certainly initially, but maybe on an ongoing basis? If that is required, then clearly asking someone to do that aspect as well as maintain the commercial relationship might be a little bit of a stretch. So, product complexity is one aspect of it. And that might also include the breadth of your products. So you might have just one product, or you may have 15 products. So that's sort of one variable. Another variable sort of goes back to what we talked about before, which is sort of the growth of the company and the
Right.
number of customers who you have. If you've got 5 customers, you could probably get away with one person doing both roles.
Mhm.
As you go out to 500, 5,000, clearly you can start thinking about some specialization. So just the size of your company. The third aspect, I think, really comes down to good old-fashioned financials and the P&L. Clearly, there is some benefit in having 2 people service an account,
Right.
but for a lot of companies, that's just not financially viable. So you do need some person to sort of play both roles.
Got it. Okay. Well, so, we're kind of getting into the P&L and some of these operational
Yep.
things. So let's, and I know that's been a lot of your background, is really focusing on the operational aspects of this. So
Yeah.
let's get down to one of the core things that underpins operations, which is metrics, right? And so,
Yep.
uh, what are so kind of in this broader customer success view that we
Mhm.
just talked about, commercial and less commercial, I suppose. What are the key metrics that you think B2B subscription orgs, and that's really the focus of a lot of our conversations here. So B2B
Sure.
subscription revenue orgs, what are those key metrics that they need to be focusing on in their customer base to think about the health of their business?
Yeah. So the way I think about this, Hayes, is almost categorizing the metrics into 2 different types.
Okay.
So there's almost like an outcome metric,
Yep.
and then there's sort of the leading indicator or the driver metric.
Mhm.
So let me talk about those. So the outcome metric is essentially what you're trying to achieve. And so from my perspective, especially if you think about sort of companies that are at the early growth stage,
Mhm.
it fundamentally comes down to retention or gross revenue retention or gross logo retention. That's pretty much it. There are a lot of other metrics. I'm going to talk about those in a moment. But at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get customers to be retained. That's it.
Right. So can we
As you start,
real
yeah.
quick on that? I want to touch on it because I think that uh, when I talk to revenue leaders or founders even at earlier stage companies, there's often this they're starting to really try to understand the different types of retention, and we're starting to drill into
Mhm.
that right now. So just in
Yeah.
the event that somebody's listening to this and is thinking about, okay, well, dollar retention versus logo retention and gross
Yeah.
versus what I'm guessing you might talk about soon, which is net.
Yes. Yes.
Maybe just level set us on
Yeah.
the basics there. How should we
Yeah.
be thinking about what is gross dollar retention? What is gross
Sure.
logo retention?
Yeah. So for both your gross metrics, both whether it be revenue or logo, all you're looking at is a comparison of how much dollars or how many logos there were compared to a prior period, which could be on a monthly basis or it could be on a yearly basis. But you essentially say, if I start with 100 customers,
Mhm.
after a period of a month or a year, how many customers do I have left? And that becomes essentially your retention rate. And
Right.
if you do it on dollars, well, I start with 100. Sorry, if you're doing logos, well, I start with 100 logos.
Mhm.
After a month or after a year, how many logos of those 100 still remain?
Right. So the
So that's
important thing is the
essentially
basis is in the cohort that you start with a cohort and
correct.
then you look at attrition from that cohort specifically without allowing um, upsells or
New
other
guys.
things that new guys to impact it. So that's gross.
Yes,
So I think
exactly.
that's
Yep.
super core. So appreciate that kind of 101, but I think that's
Yep.
really important.
Yep. That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. Which then leads into the next topic, which is obviously net revenue retention.
Mhm.
So for and I think this is probably might be a little bit controversial, but I'll say it anyway.
Hot take.
Net,
Here we go.
yeah, well, then maybe this will this will call this video to go viral. Fantastic.
All right.
So net revenue retention is obviously even more critical. So to level set what we were talking about before, net revenue retention is where we're looking at the gross, but now we're looking at what the impact is of additional dollars that you might extract from that existing customer base. So
Mhm.
it's really net revenue retention is only really applicable to dollars. It doesn't really work for logos.
Yeah.
But let's start off with that $100 scenario. Well, you might lose $20 from customers who don't return, but then you may sell another $30 worth of services to the 80 customers that retain. And so in that case, your net revenue retention is actually $110
Mhm.
And so your net revenue retention exceeds 100%. And that's obviously the holy grail.
Right.
Now, I sort of advocate for focusing in on net revenue retention as a metric or as a goal
Mhm.
after you've gone sort of over that initial growth stage.
Mhm.
And the reason I say that is because unless you're focused on gross revenue retention, what will end up happening is you will kind of forget about your existing customer base. And that ultimately means that you might go through all of your customers. You can't expand or upsell into a customer base if you don't have a customer base. So that's number one.
Right.
And number two is by really obsessing around gross revenue retention in the early stages, you actually get a sense of whether your product is actually good and whether your account management team are actually good and whether your company's good. It's very easy for companies to obfuscate some of the underlying problems just because they've got one or two stellar salespeople who are killing it on the expansion side.
Mhm.
And you don't want to get that obfuscation. You actually understand, especially in the early stages, what's going on with the business.
Right.
Once you feel good about that, then by all means, go out and focus on net revenue expansion. The third point, if I could sort of expand on this as well, is that typically when you're early, you don't have anything to sell because all of your time and energy from a product development perspective
Mhm.
has been poured into that single product.
Right.
So it's very unfair to hold your customer success team to a net revenue retention, which essentially means that you're trying to sell your customers more stuff if there's no more stuff to sell. So it's
Right.
only after you've got a sort of a set of products you can sell that you really need to be focusing on net revenue retention.
And so when you think about the set of products you can sell, I think about it as two things. When you think about expansion, right? How you get from that, how you get that extra $10 from the existing
Mhm.
customer base in your example earlier. You've got upsell, which is more usage of the same thing, roughly,
Yep.
right? And then you've got cross sell, which I tend to think of like getting a customer to use another thing that you have to
Yep.
offer, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
so I think you're right in the early days, almost by definition, and not to dwell on the early days in this conversation, but I think that's where this gets really tricky. Is in the early days you don't really have cross sell, right? Like you're not going
Yep.
to have you're not serving 10 different use cases within the same organization, and there's a
Correct.
whole bunch of people you can sell to, but you may have expansion, right? So maybe you sell a
Yep.
product that's based on seats, and your new business team has landed 10 seats, but you learn as an account manager that there's probably 50 seats at full penetration, right? So
Yeah.
um, you know, does that change your calculus at all about how much you think about NRR? Like if you have an internal expansion path that's more upsell driven from the same solution, do
Yep.
you think about it differently in the early stages, or do you think it's still important to focus on GRR as a metric of whether or not you can ever even be successful? Because if you can't retain customers,
Yeah.
you're screwed.
Yeah. And I think we'll probably talk about this in a little bit, but I think it really comes down to what do you want your team to obsess about?
Right.
So, especially in the early days, do you want your team obsessing about that retention aspect, or do you want your team obsessing about selling more seats?
Right.
Because that will actually impact the types of people you hire, impact your processes, it will impact everything. And
Right.
so I would argue that in the early days, it's great if you can go from 10 seats to 20 seats.
Hmm.
But I don't think that's what you want your team to be obsessing about. I think you want your team to be obsessing about making sure those 10 seats are just knocking it out of the park. And that by definition will open up more opportunities.
Hmm.
But I don't think you want them obsessing about 10 to 20 seats.
Okay. Well, actually, I like this idea of what are they obsessing about, right? And I
Yep.
think that actually dovetails a lot of how I think about hiring roles if you're in a growth stage. Like when
Yep.
you decide that a thing needs to be obsessed about, that's when you hire, right? Like you hire someone to
Yep.
be obsessed about it, and then you make sure that you have a teams ultimately to be obsessed about it.
Yep.
And so I wanted to drill into that obsession with retention, right? And so
Yep.
I read a really interesting and I can't believe I'm saying this, but I read a really interesting Gartner report recently that was about account management teams and often the lack of expansion selling that happens in
Yeah.
these teams. And so one of the things that they highlighted, which really resonated with me because it fits with my experience of what I've seen a lot of account managers do, is that account managers often get very, very retention focused, which you want, right? And
Hmm.
so there's always a
Hmm.
balance. But uh, one of the things I feel like I've heard from account managers a lot in my lifetime is yeah, you know what, we're gonna be able to upsell these guys next quarter, right? But this quarter, they've got these issues and we really need to focus on dealing with this first and make sure they're happy, and then we can do the upsell. It's like they kind of need to get permission to do the upsell by servicing the customer, which is to some degree true, but often what I think happens is it's used a little bit as a crutch, right? Like we don't
Yep.
want to have this conversation because we're so much more comfortable as account managers focusing on retention and purely retention and servicing, right? That almost
Yep.
we in some cases will overservice the customer in order to kind of avoid um,
Yep.
the maybe more difficult expansion conversation. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that phenomenon.
Yep.
Is that a real phenomenon? And if
Yep.
so, how do you think about that balance between retention and expansion if you consider them even in opposition to each other?
Yeah, yeah. One of my favorite account reviews I did with an account manager when we were sort of going through their book of business, and it was 60 or 70 accounts. We were just sort of doing a status check on how those accounts were doing, and sort of asking them, is this one going to return? Is this one? Are we good on? Are we safe for renewing this customer? Yes. Are we safe for renewing this customer? Yes. Went through the entire list, and every customer was green lighted. It was fantastic. It was the rosiest picture I've ever seen.
Right.
And then the moment I said, okay, so who's right for expansion? It's like, oh, no, 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 no. No one's ready for expansion now. They've got this issue with this customer and this issue, this customer has that issue, and we've got to resolve these tickets. You're like, hang on, that doesn't make sense. And I think it highlights exactly the point that you're making, is that account managers are too often are very, very comfortable in the renewal conversation, but by definition, they're not as comfortable with expansion conversation. So the way I think about that, Hayes, is, I challenge account managers or CSMs, whoever is responsible with this, which is the goal of an account manager is not to sell.
Mhm.
Okay. The goal of an account manager is to help solve problems for their client.
Okay.
And sometimes that problem can be solved with the existing product set.
Mhm.
Other times it can be solved with a new feature that can be turned on for free. Other times it can be solved with a new feature or a new product for which there must be a cash transaction. And other times it may not be able to be solved at all. But the thing that I think a lot of account managers forget, and honestly, a lot of managers of account managers forget, including the executive team, is the goal is not to sell. The goal of a sales team, typically new business, is to sell. The goal of the account management team is to ensure that the customer is getting value out of the platform and that their pain points are being solved.
Mhm.
And if it's not, then hopefully there's a product out there for which a cash transaction will occur, and that's how you get the expansion opportunities. So let me give you an example, if you can indulge me. So going back to your license example. So we've sold 10 licenses into this fictional customer. Now, the wrong approach, I believe, would be to go to that customer and say, "Hey, it looks like you're having great success with these 10 seats. Can I some more seats? Can I sell you more seats? I'll give you a package deal. End of month for crazy Eddie pricing. I'll add 5 for the price of 4."
Right.
Is the wrong approach. And I think that's a mentality that a lot of account managers don't like doing, and they're scared. Change that conversation a little bit, whereby in saying, hey, looks like your 10 users are getting a lot of value out of this.
Mhm.
Are there anyone else in the organization, those 10 users purchased this platform to solve this problem. Who else in the organization's having this problem?
Mhm.
Oh, yeah, Bill and Felicity and Jane. Great. Well, can we set them up with some seats as well? Yeah, that's a great idea. Boom, you've got your expansion.
Mhm. Okay.
So, except that is a difficult mindset to shift,
Mhm.
especially in the minds of the executive team, because all they care about is more dollars. But that's the mindset that I think a successful account manager will want to take as they approach that expansion sort of concept.
So, you know, if you frame it as solving problems for your customers, right? And I like the altruism, and I think it's not just altruism, right? I mean, it ultimately, if you're not solving problems for your customers, at some point they're no longer going to be your customers, right? So that it's a
Correct.
point
Yep.
well taken. But you know, do you think that ultimately these kinds of roles, we started this conversation saying, there's sort of a split between maybe the service
Hmm.
element and the commercial element. Do you
Yep.
think that ultimately, now, so we've been talking about early stage, let's switch to more scaled out organizations, right? Um,
Yep.
if you were talking to an organization that's in more of a growth stage, or maybe they've hit some kind of scale, would you say that the retention and expansion relationships, and let's focus in on the commercial side, not really the service side,
Yep.
um,
Yep.
should that be the same person, right? Should you have the same person focused on retaining the dollars and adding new dollars from the customer, or is there a role for an expansion team that's responsible for growth?
Yeah, great question. And honestly, Hayes, I've seen it both ways,
Mhm.
and we could sort of debate this topic till the cows come home. I think some of the variables that it depends upon are some of the things that we talked about before. So it depends upon the types of customers you have, the complexity of products that you have, the price points, a lot of different variables. I think what is actually more important is that whatever path you choose, whether you decide to keep it separate, whether you combine it, whether you build out an entire separate sales organization, whatever your path is, the most important thing is that you define it and
Mhm.
you make it very clear about who's doing what in the organization. Number two is that you hire the right people into that organization. And then number three, you metric and reward the people in those organizations to do the job that you want them to do. Where I see this fail and where I see a lot of tension is where you have an organization which is called, for better or worse, customer success. They're clearly focused on making sure the customer gets value.
Right.
You've hired people, you've got a comp structure that sits around that, you've got the metrics around that, and everything's working well. And then suddenly someone comes in and says, hey, customer success team, I'm going to now stick $100,000 quarter quota on you that you must go and achieve.
Right.
And that's where you start to get this dysfunction
Mhm.
because that person in that role, the processes, the infrastructure, the comp system is not designed to support this expansion. So
Right.
as long as you're very deliberate about what you're doing and then everything flows from that, it doesn't really matter what the specific organization is that you do, or the organizational structure
Mhm.
that you decide to take.
So you touched on one topic that I always think is really fascinating because it ultimately governs incentives for your reps,
Yes.
which ultimately governs behavior
Mhm.
because people respond to incentives. So let's talk about comp. What are
Right.
some of the? That's another topic we could talk about for hours and hours,
Correct.
which we don't have here. But you know, are there, if you're starting to think about these challenges in a scaling or growth type situation where you're thinking about the commercial relationship as it relates to GRR, the commercial relationship as it relates to expansion, and the service relationship, like how do you need to start thinking about comp in these cases? And
Yep.
I'll add one other thing here, which is that one of the things that I think is often a challenge for comp for teams that are focused on the customer success world is the comp structures often get kind of complicated. I feel like,
Mhm.
and it's
Yep.
because of these sort of dueling mandates of growth and retention and all of that. Whereas
Yeah.
new business, you can make it complicated, but at the end of the day, you brought a dollar in, you get a piece of that dollar back, right? Like that's kind of
Yep.
how the comp
Yep.
structures work. And typically that's pretty aligned with how the business wants it to work, right? So,
Yep.
at a high level, what are some of the, maybe it would be even, what are some of the pitfalls, I guess, in terms of how you start designing comp for these different kinds of roles? Where can it all go horribly wrong?
Yeah. I think let me start at a different place, which is most people in these types of roles will typically do a base plus sort of an incentive type of structure. The incentive, in my opinion, needs to be directly tied to the outcome that you're trying to achieve, and that's, I think, what's going to vary.
Mhm,
So if you think about sort of that more commercially orientated person, well, the outcome that you're trying to drive is retention and or expansion.
mhm,
So tie their comp to that outcome. If you think about someone who's sort of got that more traditional CSM type of model, well, their outcome that you're trying to get for them is around product adoption, product usage. Well, why don't you tie the variable comp to that?
mhm,
And that was something we did in one of the older organizations I worked at recently, was we actually had the CSMs who had a component of their incentive pay tied to usage and adoption and the number of people that were logging in on a regular basis. The account management team were tied to much more traditional sort of GR and NR.
mhm.
So I think as long as you understand what you're trying to drive that individual to do and you match the comp to that, then I think you can actually solve some of the problems. I think the complexity that you referred to often is driven by a lack of infrastructure or a lack of data,
Mhm.
because ultimately it should be a relatively simple structure to put in place in principle. Where it starts to fall down is when the execution, because you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the data, or you need to build out all these exception cases of, well,
Mhm.
that works well for customers 1, 2, 3, but it doesn't really apply to customer 4 because customer 4 is, overseas, or it's a channel partner, or something else. So that's where I think some of those complexities can arise. But the principles are pretty straightforward.
So, one of the places I think the complexity shows up is, the reality is most of the time you have one person who's responsible for the commercial relationship, and so they are tasked with retention and expansion, right? And so,
Mhm.
I've seen comp plans that are, you know, just go get us dollars, right? Like you
Yep.
started with $1 million, right? At the end of the day, the end of next year, we should have 1,000,005 or whatever, right? Like,
Yep.
that kind of thing. And then there's other plans that are, we expect a certain baseline level of GRR and retention, and then there's some kind of an
Yeah.
incentive for, going above that, right? And so
Yep.
the challenge with the first plan, while it's nice from a revenue standpoint, you don't really know whether or not somebody has eroded their customer base by 50% and somehow, like, had a bluebird come in that, like, allowed them to hide that erosion, right?
Yep. Yep.
So how do you think about that? Because the reality is most of the time it's one person. How do you balance the retention
Yeah.
versus expansion incentives?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I spent many, many, many hours debating
You
with
don't
various executive teams on this
you don't have
topic
the perfect
specifically.
answer for this? I don't
I do. It's just about
expert
convincing everyone
Q&A.
else what the perfect answer is. No, you're absolutely right. The right answer
Mhm,
is the latter,
mhm,
which is where you need to have some base level, you need to have incentives tied to both base level gross revenue tension,
mhm,
and then you need to have an incentive tied towards expansion. Because fundamentally, those are the two things that are going to make the company successful on a long term sustained basis.
mhm.
And it's that long term sustained basis that it's critical to think through. Because if you're thinking in a very short term horizon,
Right.
meaning in the next 12, 18, 24 months, we'll get a new round of funding or we'll get an exit,
Mhm.
all we need to do is just focus on revenue, just top line growth. And I don't care where it comes from, how it comes from. All I care about is revenue. Well, it kind of lends itself to that first model where I don't care if you're eroding your customer base.
Right.
But if you're thinking about trying to build a sustainable company that has a life beyond, 12, 18, 24 months, the last thing you want to do is let sales reps or account managers uh, not pay attention to their entire customer base, because they know that when push comes to shove, they can always go back over to their customer Bob, because Bob's always good for another 10K each
Right.
month because you and he play golf together.
Right. Okay. And I think that goes back to some of the challenges that I think exist in the early days, as you start to get some scale, right? Like, and I was having a conversation with somebody about this the other day. They asked me lessons learned working at a larger company, versus sort of startup. And I think one of the biggest things is just pure math. Where does your revenue come from, right? If you think about
Yep.
whatever your ARR run rate is, right? Like, um, is that revenue coming from a large existing customer base because you're a mature company,
Mhm.
right? And then ultimately new business almost doesn't move the needle for you, because I mean it's important, but it ultimately isn't going to make your
Yep.
quarter, right? It's the retention that makes
Yep.
your quarter. But if you're a early stage, new business is what makes your quarter, right?
Yep.
And so I think one of the big challenges in that early stage is you can't afford to really think too much beyond the next 18 to 24 months, right? Because like, you in many cases, you might be lucky to survive that long, right?
Yeah.
When you're more mature, you can think about, okay, in 5 years, we expect the revenue base from these customers to be X, right? But when you're in
Yep.
early stage, you can't do that. But you can also very easily set yourself, I like to call it a churn trap, right? Where you think in a SaaS company, just because I'm most familiar with SaaS and I've spent most of my time there, you're doing all this acquisition and you figured out that channel, and things are looking really good, and you're telling yourself things are great because we grew revenue, 200% last year from new business, but you have no idea whether or not those folks are going to stick around when their contracts come up for renewal, right?
Yep.
And so you may find that suddenly this business that looks really good has this really hard asymptote that basically is like, you can't get above this threshold because your bucket is leaking faster than you're ever
Yes.
going to really be acquiring companies. So
Yep.
when you're in that growth stage, when you're kind of fooling yourself with new business acquisition, right? But at the same time, that's the only way that you get a chance to even figure out retention, is
Yep.
because you're acquiring customers. How do you start figuring out whether or not you're screwed, right? Like, how do you start figuring out whether or not customers are gonna stick around, when the reality is it's
Yeah.
gonna take a year before you even know that?
Yeah. Um, I think to the extent that scale enables you to do that,
Mhm,
it's really about staying close to your customers.
mhm,
And by staying close to your customers, I mean, I think what you're looking at and what you're trying to measure is you're trying to understand, what are they using your product? And
mhm,
if so, which parts of the product are they using it for? And what are they using it for?
right,
So getting a very good understanding of what the true stickiness of your product is absolutely critical, because that will give you some indication of whether the product is actually going to be sticky for that customer, or more importantly, can it rise from a nice to have to a must have?
right,
Obviously, the ideal is mission critical.
mhm,
That's a lofty aspiration to have, but can you get away from need to have to must have?
mhm,
Um, I think sticking close to your customers to understand, what are they happy with and what are they not happy with?
mhm.
Which aspects of the product, which aspects of the customer service, which aspects of the company are they happy with and they're not happy with? I think you want to get really good on this. Sorry.
Real quick on that,
Yeah.
happy with, not happy with.
Yeah.
How do you measure that, right? Do you like,
Yeah.
I think NPS is a little bit bullshit in a lot of cases, right?
Yes.
CSAT
100% agree.
can be biased, right? How do you try to
Yeah.
figure that out other than just subjectively saying, "Hey, are you happy?"
I honestly, Hayes, I think it's that. I mean,
Yeah.
I think you can put some qualitative metrics in place like NPS and CSAT or whatever you want to do, but I think it's about having constant and regular conversations with your customer.
Mhm,
And if you have people who are skilled, they can actually tease out, they can ask the right questions to understand what's really, really going on.
mhm,
I think the other thing which people is not often thought of, especially in those early stages, would be, and again, this requires a conversation with your customer, would be to understand what's happening in the competitive landscape.
Mhm.
Because I can guarantee you that if you've got a customer on a 1 year contract, there is going to be a competitor who is pitching your customer at that 7, 8 month mark.
Right.
And to the extent that you can understand what that competitor is pitching in terms of products, pricing, packaging, that will give you a sense of whether you're at risk or not.
Mhm.
And to the extent that you can understand that, I think that starts to help you build a picture of, are we screwed or not? Because if the competitors are coming in
Mhm.
more aggressively with better products and with better pricing, yeah, you're going to be screwed. And vice versa as well. If your product is actually superior, then you probably bought yourself another year,
Right.
which was good to know.
Okay. I think that that this is the type of thing that I think we could dig into for all of these topics. Seem like topics
Hours.
we could keep digging into. I want to. I think I want to wrap up here with just one thing I always like to ask is you know uh, when you're in that growth stage, when you're starting to figure things out, you've got a decent amount of acquisition, and you've kind of got the flywheel going a little bit. What do you think the biggest mistake that folks make is when they're starting to try to get those year two kind of renewals and make sure that things are really going, like where can it go wrong, as you
Yeah.
start to see that glimmer of hope as the flywheel goes?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think there are a couple of areas in which it can go wrong. One is not having the right metrics in place. So we talked about a couple of the metrics which are
Yep.
very important. We didn't get a chance to talk about some of those leading indicators
Yep.
like usage, like productivity metrics. If you don't have a good dashboard in place, then you're not getting visibility of what's actually happening in the organization. So that's number one. Number two kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, which is if you're not staying close to your customer, then what's going to happen is you're going to try and do that renewal. And that could be either at year one or year two or year three.
Mhm.
And you're going to be totally surprised because the world has moved on, your customer has moved on, and you weren't paying attention.
Mhm.
And so, too often times when I've been working with account managers and we suddenly get surprised that the renewal doesn't come on, when you probe into it, the customer sort of says, well, I haven't actually been using your product for the last 4 months because it didn't do X, Y, Z. At which point you want to reach into the screen and throttle them to say, yes, it does. There's a great big red button on the product says we do that. How did you? Oh, yeah. Anyway, we're going to move on to another competitor. Like, ah, so just staying close to your customers is critical.
Yeah. That makes so one, actually, I was about to wrap up, but I do have one other thing I think that we haven't really touched on. We've spent a lot of time on metrics, right? We've talked
Yep.
some about incentives and that kind of thing, but I wanted to touch on one thing that I think is unique to this part of the business, which is actually a little bit of like a employee psychology kind of thing.
Hmm.
I think that it's very, very hard to be a new business sales rep. You're getting told no constantly, right? But you're always
Hmm.
holding out the like, okay, the next person's gonna say yes, and I'm gonna
Yep.
pull this in, and I've won this deal, right?
Yep. Yep.
From a retention standpoint, your job is to come in every day and just not lose. Right. Like I mean it's a very, and we as human beings, there's this idea of like loss aversion, right? Like once we think
Sure.
something's ours, the idea of losing it is painful, almost like psychically, almost physically, that someone's going to take this away from me. And so when you're an account manager, you walk in every day with like these things that are yours, these customers, right? And then you have to deal with success being not having too many of them walk away, right? So
Yeah.
how do you manage the psychology of that? It just feels very challenging to keep your level of excitement and enthusiasm up when success means just losing not all that often.
Oh, you're such a glass half empty.
Well, maybe that's just my own mentality, but I feel like
Yeah.
that's just a challenge.
Yeah, no, I think that's one approach to take it. But I think what I find in account managers and CSMs who are kind of born to do this
Mhm,
is that's not the mentality, or that's not the approach they're going in with. Is it's not about, let me try and hold on to, those 5 customers who are at risk. I
mhm,
think it's kind of the inverse,
mhm,
which is, let me try and continually help and re-win the
mhm,
95 who are going to stick around. What can I do today to make this a successful outcome for my customers? So, the company I work with now, Scorpion, they just had a great example of where a customer was going through a little bit of a tough time on the personal front. The account team sort of rallied around, sent this great sort of encouraging message, and the customer was blown away.
mhm,
And so I think that's an example of the approach that you can take, which is, I'm not trying to not lose.
mhm.
I'm actually trying to win and re-win those 95 customers every single day. And if I can do that, then I know that I'm successful.
Okay, so maybe it's my own gloomy personality then. So
We'll work on that.
the right mentality then is to think about I'm actually winning every single day that I'm keeping these customers
Yes.
around. So okay, all
Yeah.
right.
And if I lose one, it sucks,
Mhm,
but that serves as inspiration to make sure that I don't lose any more and I continue to win others.
got it. Okay. Well, this has been a really great conversation. I think there's probably
Thank you.
5 other sub conversations that could last,
Yes.
an hour in their own right. And maybe we'll do it again sometime, and dig
I
into
look
some
forward
of
to it.
those things. So really appreciate you coming on and having this conversation. This has been great. Thanks, Azim.
Yeah. No, thanks for been absolutely wonderful to be here, Hayes. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right.